I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation, Rooted in Fire: Sustaining Nebraska's Prairie and Grasslands. My name is Lauren Smith, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there are a few rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section throughout the webinar. But if you want to save your questions until the end of the presentation, that works as well. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we very much greatly appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Tonight, we welcome Dr. David Wedin, and I will let him introduce himself and take it away.
Cool. Well, I just put a little hi everyone message in the chat box. Um, I I've been teaching a long time. I love interacting with people. So the Zoom format's a little awkward. So you'll keep my spirits up if you occasionally say something or send an emoji or ask a question. That's okay. I don't have a lot of a really long talk, and we're going to go down a lot of rabbit holes. And you can even pick some of the rabbit holes we go down if you want. So if you have something you want to interrupt, that is just fine. We'll get to the end of 60 minutes one way or the other. So let me share my PowerPoint. Cool. Lauren, you can see that okay?
Yep, everything is good.
Okay. And I'm going to change the little, since I can't see anybody, change the little pictures of people boxes. Okay. And somebody type me a message, hello, in the chat box, just so I know you're out there and I'm not alone. Jacqueline and Karen, and thank you. And Kathy and Alexis. Great. This is fun. Can't wait to chat with you. So, um, yeah, I'm the director of Center for Grassland Studies. I've been in that role a couple of years. That's an East Campus. It's different than the Center for Great Plains Studies, University of Nebraska. And I've been a faculty in the School of Natural Resources on East Campus for 27 years, quite a long time. And if you are in Lincoln or have a chance to be in Lincoln, I encourage you to look at the landscaping on the north side of Hardin Hall at the corner of 33rd and Holdridge, because it's been a group project in the School of Natural Resources. We've planted a teaching prairie out there, and it looks really good this year. Kind of cool. Um, and I'm also in charge of about 500 acres worth of university grasslands, including 9 Mile Prairie on the northwest side of town. So one of the things, so I'm going to preface, I'm haunted by history. And it seems like as I get older, that just gets worse. So we're going to go down some paths and talk about some ideas and history and concepts. Might be a little different than what you were expecting. But hopefully you enjoy that, gets you thinking of some questions. One of the things I struggle with, and we have struggled with, we're called the Center for Grassland Studies. Well, here's a bunch of titles or words that all mean grassland. And what we found is there are such different perspectives on grasslands. Recruiting students into our undergraduate program, which is called Grassland Systems, I find that if we're recruiting students from the Midwest or Kansas City, where Lauren's from, or Omaha or Lincoln, the word prairie resonates. But if you're in Western Nebraska, the word rangeland resonates. We'll talk about that a bit more. So I have two different brochures for recruiting undergrads to our program. It's exactly the same program. It's the same content. We just somehow have to get our foot in the door and get them interested. But a little question for those of you around Lincoln and in this part of Nebraska. Yeah, Spring Creek, fill in the blank. Prairie seems to fit there. So uh, so when we teach a course in grassland conservation for our seniors, it's what we call a capstone course. The, oops, uh, one of the things we emphasize, regardless of your perspective on grasslands, we want all of our students to have the same toolbox. Uh, and some of these things you need to know to be working in grassland management, conservation, whether you're raising beef or you're trying to manage a remnant prairie for biodiversity, you need to understand how you would develop seed mixes, where do you get materials, how do you plant them, prescribed fire is important, grazing becomes an important management tool, mowing and haying. We have increased encroachment of woody vegetation. And then there's all of the tools that we want our students to have to work with conservation and natural resources. I'm not, if you were hoping tonight I was going to explain how to use all these different tools, I'm really not. Uh, there's lots of, pick any of these, Google it, and you'll find some YouTube videos on how to use that for grassland conservation in different regions. Um, but I do want to talk about is, uh, I think I'll get to this in a second. The other, setting the stage where we're at. I assume most of you from Nebraska, but maybe not. Maybe we picked up people from far away. If you can see my cursor, we're over here in this blue area of eastern Nebraska with the original North American grassland biome. This would have been called tall grass prairie. We'll see Nebraska in this representation has northern mixed grass prairie and southern mixed grass prairie, a little bit of short grass prairie out by Scotts Bluff in the west, but a mixture of grassland types. Uh, Most of that has been altered or is gone. Um, and we'll talk later about, how do we determine our management goals? And what role do these historical looks at what was grassland? What role does that history play? But here's a paper that Reinhard Schultz and Dirk Twidwell, it came out a couple years ago. They did a global analysis. I just cut and paste North America here. And they were looking at kind of the grassland biomes and grasslands of the entire world and saying, where are there big chunks of intact grassland left? And not surprisingly, most of it's gone. If we look at what we think of as the tall grass prairie, and this juts out into northern Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. Some maps will even take it into Ohio a little bit. This peninsula of prairie, tallgrass prairie, uh, that was great land for agriculture. It's mostly been converted to row crop agriculture. So you see in Reinhardt and Drax's map below, less than 1% of that grassland remains in most of the tallgrass prairie. This little green band right here, south of us, Lauren and I were talking briefly. This is the Flint Hills of eastern Kansas. If you go down to K-State at Manhattan, Kansas, they have a wonderful grassland research site, wonderful nature trail uh, at Kanza Prairie. And most of this is intact. It's tall grass prairie, a little bit drier because it was too rocky to plow, too rocky to turn into cropland. But I want to emphasize we go right from eastern Nebraska, where it's mostly been converted to agriculture, tiny remnants of native grassland left in eastern Nebraska, much like I grew up in Iowa, same situation in Iowa. And then this dark green band right here is the Nebraska Sandhills. So I brought visuals, right? There's a new book out on the Nebraska Sandhills. It's an edited book that the different folks at UNL put together. I recommend it. It's not too expensive. Um, and a good background and gorgeous. A lot of photography by the conservation photographer Michael Forsberg. But the sandhills come out as 60 to 85% intact grassland. And actually, Reinhardt and Drac concluded that the sandhills are the most intact native grassland left on Earth. Uh, and so, if you haven't had a chance to go out for a drive through the sandhills For instance, take Highway 2 from Grand Island. Once you get to Broken Bow, you pick up the Sandhills all the way to Alliance. It's just an amazing landscape. Okay. So that kind of is a paradox here because we have within Nebraska different types of grassland, like we see in the biome up here, but grasslands that are in very different condition. Like I said before, to manage these grasslands, we use the same tools, but what are the goals? Why are we managing these grasslands? So, what are our goals for grassland and prairie conservation? So again, I warned you, we're not going to go through all the different methods you would use to manage a grassland. Great YouTube videos on that. We're not going to go through a description of what kind of grasses and flowers or birds and rodents or anything, insects, pollinators you find in different grassland types. Great YouTube videos on that. You're going to, I guess, be stuck with me for the next hour thinking philosophically about why are we doing this? Okay. Uh, to the west, in what is the Sandhills and other kind of short grass, mixed grass prairies, 50% of Nebraska is still grassland. Okay. 90% of those grasslands are privately owned. They're what I call working grasslands. People have to pay taxes. People have to make money. People have to send their kids to college, okay, with their profits off that grassland. So these are working lands, and most of it is used for beef production, and they're working rangelands. If we want to address conservation of grasslands in Nebraska, I mean, we have wonderful protected prairie areas like Spring Creek Prairie here in Lincoln, and Fontanelle Forest is trying to restore some prairies, Glacier Creek in the Omaha area. But the big battles and the big opportunities are on privately owned working lands. And we often will use the word stewardship, you know. So how does it's a different approach, different assumptions, but there's a lot of sense of stewardship in the owners of our private rangelands. I just find and that's usually looking west from Lincoln. Looking east, uh, in Iowa, I don't know why there's characters here, but less than 4% of the original tallgrass prairie remains in the Midwest. And I would include the eastern edge of Nebraska in that. So then people are often concerned with, well, how do we preserve these tiny remnants of native prairie and how do we restore? So I have a picture of a couple of women here with native prairie plants from the Xerxes Society, which deals with, they're interested in raising pollinators. The rancher woman on the right, she's interested in raising beef and horses. Uh, and so different goals. Okay. So we have different words for grasslands. We have different goals. Like I said, we try to emphasize to our student, it's the same toolbox, but you might apply them differently. Okay. And we want our graduates in the grassland program we teach to be at least literate and comfortable on both sides, whether you're talking to a rancher or whether you're talking to somebody that is interested in protecting prairies for pollinators. Okay. So an example, I just picked a couple of mission statements here. Contrast these two approaches, okay? The Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, it's all restored, but it's 5,600 acres in the middle of Iowa. It's a little bit east of Des Moines. Uh, it was actually land set aside for a nuclear power plant, and they decided not to build it. And it ended up becoming a national wildlife refuge named after a famous Iowan congressman. Okay. But we just look at the words they're using in this National Wildlife Refuge. The mission of the refuge is to actively protect, restore, reconstruct, and manage the diverse native ecosystems of tallgrass prairie, oak savanna, and sedge meadow. These were the native habitats existing at the refuge prior to Euro-American settlement, which is going to be 1830, 1850 in Iowa. So really this preservation, restoration mindset, okay? On the other hand, if you look at the Conservation Reserve Program, those of you involved with agriculture will have heard of this, but the CRP program, with the USDA. It surprises people to know that there's over 1 million acres in Nebraska enrolled in this conservation reserve program. And did I say Iowa? I meant Nebraska. Most of that CRP land has been replanted in grassland. And increasingly in recent years, they're trying to include diversity so it makes better habitat for pollinators and birds and everything else. Um, it's over $80 million a year the USDA writes in checks to Nebraska landowners in lieu of growing crops on that land. So this is a massive grassland conservation program. Okay. You can take all the nature preserves in Nebraska, the the native preserved and restored prairies like Spring Creek Prairie in Nebraska, but the number of acres would be tiny compared to the CRP grasslands. And their goals here, things like uh, remove environmentally sensitive land from crop production, and plant species, often grassland, usually grasslands, that improve environmental health and quality. So they're talking about things like reducing soil erosion, improving water quality, improving wildlife habitat. Okay. You can see how the same tools would apply in both these contexts, but one is really a preservation goal. The other one's a stewardship of working lands goal. Let's dabble. Like I said, I'm increasingly haunted by history. I find it fascinating. I guess that happens when you get older. Let's dabble in environmental history a bit. I'm kind of riffing on the word grassland and prairie and what do these words mean, and getting us to think about the baggage that we have when we use those words and how we manage, how we set goals for management. So I can't recall how I constructed this graph about a year ago. I think it involved AI, and I was asking Google something. And I think the question was, where are the place names in the US that include the word prairie? This is the map that came back. There's a few interesting things. There's things called prairies in Florida, open grasslands. And in the Pacific Northwest, this would be the Palouse Prairie. Uh, this red line is a representation of the Great Plains as we commonly define it. The Midwest here is in this Prairie Peninsula area. There's a lot more prairie in the Midwest, not so much in the Great Plains. You can see why if I'm trying to, this is where the students are, this is where the people are: Kansas City, Lincoln, Omaha, Des Moines, Minneapolis, Chicago. If we want students to enroll at UNL, we could get every graduate from Cherry County out in western Sandhills to enroll at UNL. And that's still not going to keep the administrators happy because it's just not that many students. So tapping into this audience, the word prairie resonates. Think about that a little bit more. Why is that? And again, I was having fun with that database. The Prairie Peninsula, here's an old map, 1935, showing this area of the Midwest. Here's Chicago, here's Iowa, Missouri, was prairie. It's all gone now. It's mostly all corn and beans. I grew up in Story County, Ames, Iowa. There's a little piece of prairie behind the high school. Uh, and there's a couple of little prairies along old railway right-of-ways that went in before the 1840s. Other than that, it's all gone. Um, but again, this word prairie, uh, and I'll continue with this theme a little bit, peaked in the 1850s. This is when towns were founded that had the word prairie in the title. And then it dropped off. The 1840s, 1850s, 1830s, 1820s, we think of European settlement in Nebraska happening 1850 to 1860. That's when the bison went extinct. That's when the homesteaders started arriving. That's when the native tribes were disenfranchised and moved to Oklahoma, a lot of them. Um, but that had happened a generation, at least 25 years earlier in the Midwest. It's been, uh, that prairie was lost that much longer. But obviously, the word prairie captivated the imaginations of people. When they were coming out of the forests of the East, and they were coming into northern Illinois or southern Wisconsin, and they saw these patches of open prairie, often surrounded by bur oaks, scattered trees. They were really intrigued. They were captivated. Okay. Uh, and so you see, actually, Texas is in there, but Texas was settled kind of earlier. The eastern Texas, the hill country where they just had the flooding, that was initially settled pre-Civil War. But Texas, like the word prairie, Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, Indiana, Minnesota, Iowa. Okay. Once you get out in the Great Plains, uh, there were some towns starting in the late 1800s that had the word prairie in the name. Not many. Why is that? What's the baggage with how we look at grasslands, with and without that? So here's something I'll propose. Coming back to Nebraska, you may or may not have been to Homestead National Monument down in Beatrice, down by the Kansas border. To me, this represents a watershed, a break point, thinking about grasslands, because the Homestead Act was 1862. Starting in the 1860s and then really in the 1870s, homesteading took off in most of Nebraska. That eastern core where Omaha and stuff is, that had already been settled, or at least had been somewhat settled. But most of Nebraska, it wasn't till late 1860s, 1870s. Um, Bison didn't go extinct in Nebraska till 1870s. And when they did, they crashed big time in a hurry. Okay. I would propose, I'll throw this out. I don't know what you think of that. Uh, Before 1862, they were prairies. There were unique grassland areas that provided a contrast to the forested landscapes that American settlers were seeing, um, and whether for utilitarian purposes or just because they were pretty. Uh, People in the Midwest settling in the 1830s, 1840s were intrigued, and it's like everybody knew about that prairie over there on the other side of that river, 30 miles away. You could name it, you can put a town there, and that was a unique kind of grassland opening and probably had unique wildlife, unique plants. Okay. But we became, I think the perceptions changed. Once the Homesteading Act came in, we became much more utilitarian. I mean, grassland is a boring word compared to prairie. It's a much more utilitarian word. It is what it is. It's a grassland. Okay. And did after the homesteading became, we saw these grasslands of the Great Plains as they weren't so unique, they weren't so special. They were there to be settled, and we had a program to settle them. And if you were an immigrant from Sweden, like in or Scandinavia, you remember the little house on the prairie books, although that was called Prairie. Isn't that interesting? Although she settled in Minnesota before she went to South Dakota, she was Prairie. But these grasslands, yeah, we just had a very utilitarian. We raised cattle on them. You cut them up. You made sod houses out of grassland, uh, and you cut hay, and this is how you made a living. Okay. They lost their uniqueness, and that this more picturesque definition became replaced by a more utilitarian definition. I don't know if that works for you or not, but at least in Nebraska, 1862 is also kind of a benchmark. If we want to say, well, what did these prairies look like pre-European settlement? Usually 1850s, 1860s. Everything changed. I said I was obsessed by history. Uh, you didn't think you were going to go 30 million years back in geologic time tonight at this lecture, but you are. If you haven't had a chance, go to the new fourth floor exhibit at Morrill Hall, the Elephant Museum down on city campus. It's called Cherish Nebraska. It's a wonderful exhibit. I mean, it has wonderful old bones in it, but it tells the story in a more dynamic way than a typical museum full of paleontological specimens. But the story of Nebraska's past is the story of mammal evolution, the story of nobody tells it better than we do of when the world's great grasslands started to expand over the last 30 million years. And well, I'm going to talk some about C4 grasses. These are the warm season grasses that dominated our tall grass and short grass prairies. So these are grasses like big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, blue grama, buffalo grass. Okay. Uh, they didn't come along in abundance until about 7 or 8 million years ago. So if you look at these graphics, what you're going to see are these wonderful paleontological specimens, representations, but we're gradually going from more woody vegetation. This is 16 million years ago. You can go all the way back to 30. I think the oldest great sets of fossils of mammals in Nebraska are about 38 million years ago. Uh, all through this trajectory, up into the ice ages, we were becoming fewer trees, more grassland. Look at this final, was this be the Pliocene over here, 1.8 million years ago, just on the eve of the ice age. And what did we have? We had mastodon relatives. We had camels, both large and small. We had a bunch of different horses. Uh, this 5 million years ago, we still have several species of rhinoceros, but they went extinct. They didn't handle this transition to grassland. So, uh, bison, which we think of as the dominant native species of these grasslands, they didn't come along until about 140,000 years ago, around the time the camels and the mastodons and everything started to more disappear. So, what was going on here? And foreshadowing this trajectory, the evolution of grasslands, the evolution of grasses, the evolution of grazers, mammals with special adaptation for grazing, that is associated with, appears to be driven by a long-term changes in temperature and climate, including the seasonality of climate, and the 30 million year trajectory of atmospheric CO2 concentrations. Hint, we're kind of messing with climate and CO2 right now. And hint, we're kind of struggling with the issue of woody vegetation encroaching our grasslands. Okay, that's a big modern issue. It's like we've been here before in the last 30 million years. So, kind of geeky, humor me a little bit, but I find this just fat. This has been my hobby the last 2 years. I always was interested in environmental change, that what we're seeing now, but to have a deeper context on things like the battle between trees and grasses. Uh, what makes browsers versus grazers? Grazers eat grass, browsers eat everything else, trees and shrubs and flowers. What determines the balance between browsers and grazers in a particular environment? This graph shows a fairly recent reconstruction using lots of different methodologies. And you can see there's kind of an error bar around this, but we have this black line is estimated atmospheric CO2 concentration for the last 60 million years. Actually, the end of this graph over here at about 66 million years. Uh, somebody, so I know you're there, uh, type in what happened 66 million years ago that made a big change in our story of life on Earth. Uh, yeah, Lauren said Ice Age before that, 66 million years ago. Why are we talking about mammals? Who are we not talking about as paleontologists after dinosaurs went extinct? Yeah. I mean, I was in college when they figured out there was a huge asteroid impact. Now it's known that it was off the coast of Yucatan. Totally changed the world. Wiped out the dinosaurs, opened up this pathway for mammals to dominate. Um, so science is still learning, and it's fascinating. And then, so this is that 66 million year trajectory we're seeing here. CO2 right now, we're at about 420 parts per million, going up 200, about 2 to 3 parts per million per year. When I started teaching, I was using 360 parts per million as atmospheric CO2. Okay. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, mid 1800s, it was about 280 parts per million. During the ice ages, over the last 1.8 million years, when the ice was at its maximum extent, we went through what, 4 to 6 major ice age periods in that 1.8 million years, when the ice was at maximum extent, CO2 in the atmosphere would drop to about 180 parts per million. Why do plants need CO2? Well, they open their stomates, they take in CO2, they make sugar, right? That's how they grow. And everything else eats it. That's the basis of the ecosystem. But when your stomates are open, what happens? Uh, you lose water, you lose moisture. Okay. So the challenge for a plant, keep your stomates enough open to get the CO2 you need in the sunlight so you can drive photosynthesis, but don't do so much of open stomates that you lose all your water. If you go from 180 parts per million CO2 to 420 where we are now, uh, yeah, plants are gasping at 180. It's a different world. The color, so this has changed, and just this is dropping off into the ice age here at the end of the graph, but this is the Pliocene. So this picture here, right, is this grassland here. Okay, now the CO2 started to drop. Temperatures are actually cooler and more seasonal. Okay, the red bars on here is temperature relative to today. Blue is colder, red is warmer. Okay. And so, but again, that doesn't have our current temperature because we're up a couple of degrees centigrade already. Okay. This is just up through, the last millennium. Mhm. So I'll come back to that again. But we're changing temperature, we're changing atmospheric CO2, we're changing a lot of things. I like this representation. I found this buried in a PhD thesis of student that was working on oreodonts, weird little mammal that has no modern relatives. And so, uh, in this time when we had high CO2, it was warmer, it was moisture, forests were dominating most of the world. And then when we went from the Eocene to the Miocene, around 30 million years ago, CO2 started to drop. It started to get cooler. The climate got more seasonal. At some point, we started to get ice on the polar ice caps. Antarctic ice sheets started to form around here. We gone had our ups and downs, but all the while, grasslands are more beating trees and shrubs. We're making that transition in Eurasia, in Africa, in Australia, South America, North America. Grasslands are becoming important. Again, tour the fourth floor of Morrill Hall. Spend a little time with the exhibits. This is like fascinating story. And then we're showing Hypsodony. I could just ask anybody in the chat box, what the heck does Hypsodony mean? What's a Hypsodon mammal? Let's see if I'll wait for a second. Very paleontological term. I'll show you an example here. Okay. Well, let me show you the next picture for Hypsodony means that you've evolved molars that are really long. The enamel is huge and they continue to develop during your life as a grazer. Why? Because being a grazer is tough. It's a tough environment. Grasses are tough. They're dirty. It's gritty. It's dry. It'll just wear your teeth out. Mhm. Um, Here's an example. Again, I'm a botanist. This is everything I learned about this, I learned in the last 2 years. This is just fascinating to me. And again, you can see all these exhibits like this in Morrill Hall. A 20 million year evolution, the 20 million year story of the evolution. No, no, stop that. The evolution of grasslands and grazers. 30 million years ago, we had a lot of herbivores, like those weird little oreodonts and early hippos and horses and camels and everything else that was living in North America. Um, but they were browsers. They had teeth like this tooth on the right, which is a human tooth, right? You got your crown, that's the enamel, that's really tough, right? Even after we could find fossils and archaeological digs, we find the teeth because that's one of the toughest things organisms make are teeth. We can find shark teeth from 300 million years ago, right? The rest of the sharks long disappeared. The crown of teeth enamel is really tough. Okay. Below that is the root, right? And so if you've had a root canal, yeah, there's something down there you don't want to know about. But that's this what we call a low crown. Okay. And we can go an entire life as a browser. This upper one is an elk. This elk can spend its whole life with this amount of crown. It'll kind of wear those out during its life. Here's the root down here, but it's not that tough a life eating whatever the shrubs and trees and flowers and fruits or whatever that elk is eating. Here's a bison's tooth. This is the third molar. This is the wisdom tooth. This one's not fully expanded yet. You get three true molars. Okay. But look how long that tooth is. This is the crown. Okay. Being a grazer is tough. Yes, it's a wonderful resource, grassland. Okay. But you're going to wear out your teeth. Uh, I have a picture here. It's just another demo here. Okay. So here's a bison, uh, old bison. I don't know how, I don't know, I didn't do a fossil radiocarbon date on it. Could be ice age, 10, 12,000 years, or it could be 2 or 3,000 years. And so we can see here, this is the third molar. This is the wisdom tooth, fully expanded. Second molar, first molar. These are the true molars. And then the premolars. And this would be your third, second, first. Sometimes they call this the fourth. But let's look at how these have worn. We'll see if this works. Can you see those, Lauren? These premolars came out first. These are like baby teeth on this
Yeah, we
bison.
can see it.
And notice the crown is pretty much worn out. If you look at it sideways, the crown's very shallow. This one right here, the second premolar, crown's gone at the bottom. And once that crown of enamel is gone, you're just working on the inner stuff, which is really soft. And that tooth is, yeah, if you're an herbivore and you wear your teeth out, you're toast. So these premolars, it lost a premolar. Don't know why. Or it lost I guess, the first true molar. But then this came out first. This was worn down like these. This one came out, but notice that it is crown's only this long, right? It started this long. In probably 10 years, it has worn this crown down. And then this molar on the end is its wisdom tooth. It still has ridges, it still has enamel, it still has an abrasive surface. You can imagine this matching with a tooth above it and grinding up that grassland, getting it down into your stomach. It's a rumen, so you're going to go back and forth, ruminating on that stuff several times. Okay. Um, but so anyway, you can see how these are wearing out over time. That's why grazers adapted. There's other traits grazers have, right? You got to be able to have behavioral or behavior or somehow you can't hide in the woods if you're a grazer because you're out in the grassland. So anyway, that's fascinating to me. And so those traits and the cattle are just going to look a lot like this bison, very similar. So nothing fascinates me more than an old fossil bison tooth because you can tell a lot how it lived, how long it lived. I asked Josh Weesey, who's in charge of the bison out at the Crane Trust west of Grand Island. They have a beautiful herd that they have. I said, well, why would a bison die of old age? How long do they live? He said, well, at most 20 years. He said they usually die because their teeth wear out. So uh, grasslands are a wonderful resource, but they're tough. Okay. The next point, Nebraska is dominated by C4 grasses. Uh, so this is an estimation of original pre-settlement 1850, and we're going to see here's Nebraska, and we're mostly these warm season grasses like big blue stem, Indian grass, blue grama, buffalo grass, etc. A lot of that's corn now, except for the sandhills, which is still intact. North of this, you get more into cool season grasses. The story of C4 grasses, again, is fascinating. They evolved maybe 20 million years ago, but they really started to dominate the world uh, around 6 to 8 million years ago. Okay. When you think of the expansion of C4 grasses, there's a clear signal in Africa. Not so much here that they didn't have the ice ages in Africa, that the expansion of fire as an ecological process started to take off as these grasslands grew to dominate. Let's see here. So Nebraska, mid-1800s. This is a reconstruction based on land surveyor records. We'll get into this question of trees and grasses and fire and managing. But we tie North Dakota for the least forest. Uh, at the time of European settlement, mid-1800s, it looks like Nebraska was about 3% forest. Now it's about 6% wooded. Again, this is the tallgrass region. We had riparian forests along the major rivers, and then we had the pine forests of the Niobrara River, the Pine Ridge, and the Wildcat Hills. Okay. What's this extra 3%? Yeah, it's a lot of eastern red cedar, a lot of non-native species that have moved into our agricultural landscapes. So thinking of management, we know we have a context. This battle between trees and grass has been going on a long time. Okay. We can move that balance. This is research I've been involved in for many years up in Minnesota. For over 50 years, we have plots of land north of the Twin Cities at the Cedar Creek area with different fire frequencies. And yeah, we can push this balance between trees and grasses around with fire. Showing 3 areas here. I mean, here's an area that was burned every 4 out of 10 years for 50 years. A lot of shrubs. It's interesting. Fire doesn't necessarily control shrubs. Some of our, quote, native prairies were dense shrub thickets. Plot 15, even the tree species have changed, hasn't had any fire in 60, 70 years. This area is burned to 8 out of every 10 years. You see the seed heads of Indian grass here. Um, so no, we can use fire as a management tool. We can push this balance between trees and grasses back and forth. The question that always comes up in prairie conservation is, well, what was natural? What was, quote, the pre-settlement fire regime? Thinking that if we can restore that frequency and type of fire, we'll have restored some of this naturalness. And the plants, the pollinators, everything else will do better. Okay. In the eastern edge of Nebraska, these pictures are from Waubonsie State Park, just over the river from in the Loess Hills. If you take Highway 2 across until you hit Iowa, okay? And they've been maintaining these open ridges, which have both bur oak and chinkapin oak and some with fire, okay? You can see where the management for the state park stops because that's solid eastern red cedar. Indian Caves is using fire as a management tool. Indian Caves had over 2,000 acres of prescribed fire in 2024. The goal is not tree-free landscapes. The goal is a savanna with several species of oaks, hickories, some other species that are adapted to fire, and the scattering and the mixture of these tallgrass prairie species. But we search for this, we struggle with this question. We do this a lot in management, conservation, in grasslands and prairies. We'd say, well, what's natural? Whether it's grazing, whether it's fire, we want to, well, how did this grassland work prior to European settlement? That's our management goal. That'll help solve our problem. Unfortunately, the balance between trees and grasses is changing. A lot of things are changing, especially in a lot of the Great Plains woody species encroachment, especially eastern red cedar is accelerating. Go to some of the videos and research by Drac Twidwell. This is papers he's done, and this is from remote sensing data going back to the year 2000. And the red is just kind of pixels on this map that have made a transition from relatively open to relatively woody areas. And it doesn't mean it's 100%. Our wonderful tallgrass prairie remnants of eastern Nebraska are still within this context, but we're past the edge. And the edge is moving out in the sandhills of this woody encroachment. So I'm going to run out of time. I want to leave time for questions, but the so yeah, I just mentioned woody encroachment. I've been talking some about climate change, which isn't just average temperatures, it's also the seasonal patterns of temperature. Precipitation, if it is not as well resolved, we know we tend to get more of these bigger precipitation events. Iowa is getting more precipitation than its long-term average. Colorado's getting less. Nebraska, we're kind of at a break point. The models don't resolve. We don't have good predictions. We just know we're probably getting more big storm events. Atmospheric CO2 is increased. That affects the balance. I'll mention nitrogen really quickly. And then in the context of that, we fragmented our grasslands. We have new species, um, and we've changed, altered our fire patterns. Mhm. Grazing was always a part of this, but it interacts with everything else. That's one reason one way to ruin a tall grass prairie is just stock it with a lot of cattle and do nothing else. Mhm. So it's cheesy with this cowboy juggler here, but these are all things that are changing. Okay. Going back to this graph we had before, where we went from grassland to forest, going back in time over 60 million years, we went from lower CO2 to higher CO2. We went from cooler temperatures to warmer temperatures. We went from colder winters to less seasonal, warmer winters, and it's like the red line is where we're at right now at 420 ppm. And it's interesting that line that shows cooler than today versus warmer than today. We're right at the break point there also. Um, I'm not going to give you the answers, but I mean, we're changing the variables that have driven grasslands and their balance with trees for a long, long time. This graph's a little complex. Physiological research. Rowan was a colleague of mine. We published a bunch of papers. Rowan's the lead on those. But we can just do physiological studies in the greenhouse with our C4 grasses, like our dominant native prairie grasses in Nebraska. Sure, as you go to warmer temperatures, warm season grasses are more dominant. That makes sense. But as you go to higher CO2, C3 grasses, trees, shrubs are favored. Goes back to the physiology of the C4 pathway. Uh, the world C4s took off in dominance about 7 million years ago when CO2 started to drop to these low levels in here. Okay. Uh, a total aside, what else happened evolutionarily, paleontologically, starting in the last 5 million years? Well, it's hominid evolution. So somehow we're tied as humans into this whole environmental change in the evolution of grasslands. Okay. Fascinating. Uh, I mentioned nitrogen. Here's a map showing anthropogenic human-caused nitrogen deposition, and we'll see it's it's the eastern Nebraska, the agricultural Midwest. This is something I've studied nitrogen for most of my career. We don't have time to talk about it, but all I know, I can tell you, if you throw nitrogen on your prairie, it favors the non-native grasses. Nitrogen is changing. These kind of numbers uh, they matter. We could easily tall grass or 9 mile prairie, which I'm in charge of, was not dominated by big blue stem grass in the 1920s. We have data. Okay, it tended to be dominated by little blue stem and side oats grama with some blue grama. It tended to be dominated by shorter grasses. Why is our one of our premier eastern Nebraska tallgrass prairie preserves increased in productivity? Well, it could be climate, could be what got hurt in the Dust Bowl and didn't come back, but it's also a 30% increase in the amount of nitrogen available for everything to grow. Um, it isn't necessarily going to ruin a prairie, but it'll change it. Mhm. So I'm going to wrap this up with a metaphor. My daughter is taking a bus across Spain today. She's 25 doing some adventures, and she went by these windmills. She sent a picture from her bus, just like the ones in Don Quixote. Okay. And, I, and she was in the province that La Mancha, where Don Quixote came from. And I said, I'm going to use the word quixotic in my seminar today. So, what is our goal in conservation? We have these tools, but it's a much more dynamic environmental history than we maybe think. It's just like it wasn't like it was natural prairie, and then the Europeans came along, and now we've screwed it up, and we want to restore it back to what it was. Uh, Don Quixote declares his love to Dulcinea. Dulcinea, he imagines as a princess. No, she's just a barmaid. Okay. And so quixotic is it's a bold quest, but it's a little naive, or a lot naive. Okay. So uh, can we just look back, restore? And as we look back further, do we even know, because they were so dynamic, what those grasslands were like? That's why I would say it's quixotic to look back. Sometimes I think that I'll leave that off. You know, I feel like because I've spent my whole career working with grasslands, I feel like we're often looking in the rearview mirror. We're going forward and we're looking at what these grasslands were. And we're trying to drive by looking in the rearview mirror and say, well, yeah, that's what our goal is for restoration. That's what we're trying to preserve. And in the last 15 years, we just floored the car, right? The the picture in the rear view mirror is getting further and further back, and it's changing very quickly, and we're going very fast. Okay. And so it's kind of like we have to put our eyes forward and say, well, what do we want of these grasslands? As Chris Helzer from the Nature Conservancy says, my goal is a resilient grassland which is high in diversity and supports lots of species. He's not trying to restore native prairie. He's not trying to preserve native prairie because that's getting fainter and fainter in the rear view mirror. So I'm going to stop there. That was my philosophical musings. I don't know. I hope there was something interesting in there for you. Uh, I think Lauren wants to do a quick survey, and then we still have, 6, 7 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dave. That was very insightful. Like he said, we're going to launch a very brief survey that we would greatly appreciate it if you took the time to fill it out. It'll just take less than a minute and it helps us with programming like this one. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A section. And I know Dave would love to answer them. One question I have actually while we're waiting for people to fill those both out, is how have you seen prairies and grasslands like adapt and even like our management adapt with more non-native trees that have been like dominating our landscapes?
My rule of we just hayed part of 9 Mile Prairie this week.
Mm-hmm.
We like to use fire as a management tool. We do use fire, but it's like we're not keeping up. There's enough reasons that fire, we can't be burning 50 to a third or half of 9 Mile Prairie every year. We just don't have the resources to do that. And but I find now in eastern Nebraska, I feel like I got to have complete biomass removal at least once every 3 years, or else the shrubs and the trees are winning. Um, and so, but when you have a prairie that you're managing with fire every 2 or 3 years, because the sumac and the dogwood, they're native shrubs, but their role seems to be different. And then the red cedars are popping. That's a native tree. But then the pollinator biologists say you can't burn this prairie every 2 or 3 years. You can't hay this much of the prairie. We need those floral resources for our pollinators. And it's like, I'm trying, we're trying the best we can, but the trade-offs have changed. And what my point was just saying, well, we're trying to do what was natural. No, we're just trying to do what we need to do to maintain a vegetation. So a lot more biomass removal than we used to use. And if you talk to Drac Twidwell, and he's looking at the sandhills, which are still relatively open grassland, but some areas are starting to pick up these red cedars. He almost views it as an epidemic. When is it cost effective to remove woody vegetation from a grassland? The answer is before you have very much, right?
Yeah.
If you wait until you've already got a woody encroachment problem, you're spending thousands of dollars per acre. Maybe your money, might be the taxpayers' money. And if the neighbors aren't doing the same thing, it's a losing battle. So the rate of change has dramatically increased, which actually was Kay Hall's question too.
Yes. Yeah. So we have a question that's asking, in your years of research, what has been the most incredible change to our grassland/environment?
Uh, kind of what I was just saying, that the the rate at which the rate at which the balance between species is changing. So the cool it's a C3 world out there now. We got nitrogen falling out of the sky. That favors cool season grasses and trees and shrubs. We got warmer winters. That favors cool season grasses, trees and shrubs. We got high CO2. That favors cool season grasses, trees and shrubs. So, over the next couple of decades, I'm not saying we give up. But if you want a tall grass prairie like Michael Forsberg's picture with beautiful stands, a big blue stem, Indian grass and stuff, you're just going to have to decide how to manage for it. And you're going to have to use your tools differently. Uh, Kathy has a question here. How important are small pollinator gardens with native grasses and sedges and homeowners' lawns in the city? I think they're great. Uh, I, I complained to my colleague Drac, who's worried about red cedars taking over the sandhills. And he's always saying, well, we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of grassland out here. And I say, man, you're just throwing our small prairies in eastern Nebraska and the Midwest under the bus. It's like, what that might be all we have for that representation of biodiversity in this county, or a couple of 50 to 100 acre prairie remnants. And they're incredibly valuable. And it's not just for the biodiversity, it's for the relationship that people have, like the gardeners, the pollinators, the butterfly people. Restoration is a very social process. It's how do you it it's not just about getting some plants planted and creating a prairie. It's about that establishing a relationship, just like gardening. If the only reason people garden was to have the vegetables, I mean, you can buy the vegetables a lot cheaper than all that time you spend on your garden. It's that relationship. It's that stewarding the land that's important to them. So I'm all in favor of doing everything we can for small prairies and planting them in the Midwest and tending them and helping them grow and connecting them. Uh, I say we have sandhills envy sometimes in eastern Nebraska because, well, those are such big chunks of grassland. What difference does our little thing make? That's a wrong question.
Do we have any final questions? Someone is asking, if there was one thing individual private folks should do, what would that be? Or what would that be to help buy time before the balance, whatever it should be, is tipped too far?
I'd say like think globally, act locally. We've heard that many times. Uh, but do small things you can do to promote the those native plants, the use of the native plants, that's increasing. Hook yourself up with the Landscape Arboretum, which is part of University of Nebraska, and their native plant sales and stuff. But then also work in Lincoln. We have the Prairie Corridor Project. Their goal is like 6,000 acres of restored plus protected prairie on the western edge of Lincoln with a trail winding through it. And that's just gorgeous. So it's, you know, get involved with groups that are protecting these areas. I'll just two messages and then I'll shut up because we're out of time. One, we had a conference this summer, America's Grasslands Conference. 350 people from across North America came to Kearney, and we showed off the Nebraska's grasslands and the sandhills, and asking a lot of these same questions. What are the partnerships we need? What are the approaches we need? And a lot of this was focused on working grasslands. People pay taxes, they raise cattle on these grasslands, but they care deeply about them. And then the other thing, this new book is out. I don't know if anybody has read this book yet. These authors were at the conference. They're from the Twin Cities. And I think this book is going to have an impact. Um, and I heard him interviewed on Science Friday and public radio a month ago. And so this is kind of telling this story. I don't agree with how they say everything, but then I'm opinionated. But that I think is a good book designed to have impact with a broader audience, especially for tallgrass prairie, but for all our grasslands. That'd be a good read. Uh,
Um, do we have any final questions? And I'm going to reiterate one more time if we're waiting on any final questions.
and again, my name, I'll type it here in the message to everybody. So you know you have it, but it's right there, and you can find my Sammy. I'm happy to talk to you, uh, email you. That's part of my job, Director of Center for Grassland Studies.
We have one more question from someone from the survey, and it says, in my restoration ecology class, we are covering a changing climate and restoration projects. I know that the plains have been disseminated. How have the species changed with the plains compared to historical levels? Also, a study in the Southwest. Their ponderosa pines forests with thinning and controlled burns are actually more prone to a changing climate and wildflowers. Are we seeing this as well in the Great Plains?
Well, the first one, actually, the Great Plains have more to work with. A wonderful talk at our conference from the Southeast Grassland Coalition. They had prairies all over the Southeast, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and they're unique, valued communities with a lot of biodiversity that are worthy of restoration. But again, we could get too obsessed with big grasslands and ignore the little pieces. So the Southeast, can't remember the name, the Southeast Grasslands Coalition or whatever, does really neat stuff. And in the ponderosa pine forest, the trouble with thinning and controlled burning, yeah, they might burn more, but are they going to burn more in a way that we can manage? Are they going to enhance the diversity we want? The alternative in the Southwest is just let the ponderosa pines get crowded, and they're going to burn anyway. And when they burn, they're going to burn really hot. So, uh, yeah, it's one of those things. The game has changed. We have to think carefully and set good management goals. But I'm all in favor. We do this in the Pine Ridge. You know, there's a lot of thinning going on in the Pine Ridge of Northwest Nebraska. And how do we encourage landowners to do that? Because if we don't thin it, it is so damn flammable when it does burn. So that just it's hard questions, But
Um, Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I think that concludes our webinar tonight. As I said, if you haven't gotten a chance to fill out the survey that was launched, I will reiterate how we would greatly appreciate if you took the time to fill it out. If you want to share this with someone who wasn't able to attend tonight, or if you want to watch it again, this webinar will be posted on our YouTube in the near future with all of our past webinars. Thank you so much for attending tonight's webinar and learning more about sustaining Nebraska's prairie and grasslands. And most importantly, thank you to Dave for this presentation and giving us your time and talent. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your night.
and I would love to hear from you by email if you want to drop me a line sometime. Fun discussions we could continue. And come
Yes,
visit 9 Mile Prairie if you're in Lincoln.
it's
Cool
beautiful.
stuff.
All right,
Good?
thank you again. Yes, have a good rest of your night.
Okay.